have to say, I all of a sudden lost you all last week, and I didn't find out until afterwards that really you had lost me. I didn't know whether this was kind of a way of saying we've had enough of this parable. Uh, we'll see you next week. People do that in churches. They mentally they've had enough, and we're still going. And there's nothing worse than to be a pastor and you know that you're going and the congregation is stopped. I used to tell my students as well as myself, I said, you always want to finish just a little bit before the congregation does. If you can time it that way, then that's the best way to do it. What we're going to look at this afternoon is the parable of the lost coin, which is a short parable in the 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, verses 8 through 10. Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and her neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. I want to start off by saying, I don't know how many of you have heard the COVID report for today, but obviously it was not a good report. It was 1,300 and something here in Kentucky, and the fourth largest that we've had. And I think one of the things that reminds me in terms of teaching and preaching is it's really important to know who is our audience. And by talking about who is our audience, I'm not just talking about you, but I'm talking about myself as a listener, as a hearer. Some of you are familiar with John Claypool, who was the well-known pastor at Crescent Hill Baptist. He had a sermon that he preached called "Who is Your Audience?" And in that sermon, Claypool recognized that one of the things that he needed to do as a preacher was to try to live into and to know what was going on in the life of his congregation. So I say all of that to say the big picture here before we get to the parable is that Jesus is really in the final stages of his ministry and of his life. I've said to you before that one of the interesting things about both the Gospel of Luke as well as the history that we call Acts, both of them written by Luke, is that they are written very much in a journey form. Jesus has already spoken his last words in the synagogue, and now he is traveling. Now he is just moving, and what he's moving toward is he's moving toward Jerusalem, where he's going to die. Now, many of you have heard that referred to as the Passion of Jesus. So Jesus is moving toward his passion. And as he's moving toward his passion, his death, the suffering that he will undergo, he wants to share some things with the disciples that are important. When we get to the 15th chapter of Luke, it's important for us to know who is the immediate audience to these three parables that Jesus is going to tell. We will skip over the first verse in the 15th chapter of Luke, but that is a very important verse because it tells us who is Jesus' audience. A very diverse audience. It says that there were tax collectors and sinners who were following Jesus. Along with the tax collectors and the sinners were the Pharisees and the scribes. I suspect they didn't sit in the same part in the field. They sat in different places because really they were coming for entirely different reasons to hear things. The tax collectors and the sinners. That's kind of a word or a phrase in the Gospel of Luke to describe the needs that you and I have, that when we come to listen to Jesus, that we come with our own weaknesses, we come with our own frailties, we come with all of the things that are moving through our mind. Maybe we come in this time with some sense of fatigue. And because we are going through so much, but we're coming as the tax collectors and the sinners, but we're also coming as the Pharisees and the scribes. In the Gospels, we know that the Jews were divided into what we would call different parties or different groups. The two that are mentioned in the New Testament are the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, the Sadducees were the ones who were at the temple were the priest, and they really move out of the picture when the temple is destroyed. Because if our lives are tethered to a building or to a place, and we lose that place, as the Sadducees did, they had no reason to exist. Interestingly, it was the Pharisees. What were they tethered to? What was central to them? It was the Torah, it was the law. And they could carry the Torah with them. The Torah wasn't bound just to the temple, but the Torah was something that was mobile. You and I need to think about something that is mobile. One of the reasons why the Christian church later on prospered is that it had the mobility of being people of the book. The book could travel with them. Those of you who studied American history know that the Great Awakening on the frontier, which now would include Kentucky, the evangelists who were part of the first Great Awakening used to travel with their saddlebag, and they had in one saddlebag, one part of their saddlebag, they had the Bible, and the other one, they had the hymnal. And then they traveled to different places, and they preached, and they had the singing in this first Great Awakening, or this second Great Awakening, excuse me. So we know that the Pharisees, who are people of the book, people of the Torah, people of the Hebrew Bible, and then the scribes are with them. Now, sometimes the scribes were actually both scribes and Pharisees, but not always. But they tended to travel together. The scribes were lawyers. They were the ones who could draw up papers. If somebody wanted to get married, they could draw up the papers for that. The scribes were the attorneys of that time, and they traveled often with the Pharisees, and always keeping an eye on Jesus. I mean, in some sense, it's sad that here is somebody coming to the end of his earthly journey, and he still has to look out and see the scribes and the Pharisees who are just looking for a way to come in and find something that he says or something that he does that they think is wrong. So the big picture of the 15th chapter of Luke is Jesus is traveling toward Jerusalem. Jesus is traveling toward his passion. All right, Jesus, what do you need to say? What do you need to say to your disciples? What do you need to say to your enemies? What do you need to say to sinners and tax collectors who are coming because they want something to fill up the emptiness of their lives? What do you say to these people? The 15th chapter of Luke is what we call a trilogy. There are 3 parables that Jesus tells in the 15th chapter of Luke, all of which are oriented around being lost and being found. The first is the short parable of the parable of the shepherd who had 100 sheep. One of them wandered off, and the shepherd left the 99 in order to go find the one that was lost. Now, something about that I didn't realize until I heard Fred Craddock tell the story. Fred Craddock, as you know, got his doctorate from Vanderbilt in New Testament. He went to Claremont Seminary in California to speak, and he spoke about the lost sheep. And he said, probably I picked it up in some song that I had sung when I was a child, but I said, you know, Jesus left the 99 safely in the fold in order to go find the one that was lost. When I finished the sermon, one of the New Testament professors at Claremont came up to Craddock and said, there were so many things that were good about that sermon, but you got that wrong about the sheep. It doesn't say he left them safely in the fold. It says he left them in the wilderness, because grace is risky. Leaving something that I have safely in the fold is not risking anything. But Jesus goes to retrieve the lost sheep, and he leaves the 99 in the wilderness. What are you trying to say to us, Jesus? What I'm trying to say is that the grace that I have is risky. It is risky to be a gracious person. It is risky to be a grace-filled person. It is risky to lead with compassion. But that's the first parable that Jesus told in this trilogy, short parable of the shepherd who went and retrieved the lost sheep, left the 99. I'm sorry if you learned the song as I did, not safely in the fold. He left them in the wilderness. Craddock calls that almost Bible. He says we have a lot of that going on, almost Bible. For example, 3 wise men. Now, if you want to think that there are 3 wise men, I'm not going to do anything to hurt your feelings or anything to make Christmas less than what it is. But nowhere does it say 3 wise men. It says 3 gifts. And you look at the story in the Gospel of Matthew where the wise men appear, they don't come to the manger. They go to see Herod, and then they go to see Jesus, who by that time has moved with Mary and Joseph to a house in Jerusalem. Now, have I completely messed up the whole Christmas pageant? I know how I did it, and it's all right. I think I remember telling the story of a student that I had, and when I said something about, the wise men probably were not with the shepherds at the manger with Jesus, she raised her hand, and I could see this kind of heartbroken look on her face. And she said, she called me Dr. Bug. She said, Dr. Bug, is it all right if I still believe that the wise men were there? And it was such a pitiful look on her face that I said to her, well, just let's know that it doesn't say that they came to the manger, but if you want them to be in the manger, I don't think that's going to be anything that is a deal breaker in the kingdom of God. So she went away, and the wise men were still in the manger, and I thought to myself, there are much more important things to do battle about than that. Yeah.
This is Mike. You're aware that Baptists for years have demanded that their pastors all be seminary graduates. So we want you to go and learn all you can about the Bible. We just don't want to hear any of it when you come back to the pulpit, okay?
Yeah. Well, you can imagine how shocking this was to me when I got to seminary. I'd grown up with all this stuff, and all of a sudden I'm hearing words that I never heard and stories that I never heard. But I always thought this was interesting, Mike, because Fred Craddock, who had done his PhD in New Testament at Vanderbilt, goes to Claremont and gets the story wrong, and he's still told about that long after that had happened. Yeah, right. Some things we probably want to drop at the door as we leave seminaries. What I want to talk about is the coin. Now, some people have speculated that that this woman had a necklace with 10 coins on it, and the necklace broke. Now, I've heard that, except again, that's not of the Bible. It doesn't say anything about her having a necklace. It simply says that she had 10 coins and she lost one of them. A coin was like a day's wages. 10 coins were like months of savings. And so she turned the house upside down until she could find that coin. Now enters the parable with the same kind of ending that we will find with all three parables in this in the 15th chapter of Luke. What happens? When we find the lost coin, when the lost sheep is brought home, when the lost son comes home, what we have to do is to celebrate. And the word that is used there is joy. There is a sense of joy when somebody comes home. Now, you and I think about the gospel. When I was growing up, I grew up in a church where the gospel was very individualized. The invitation of our minister basically each Sunday was, you are lost if you don't know Jesus, and you need to come to him and be found. Now we understand that it's not just an individual thing, but it's also deals with social issues. But one of the things I would like to go back to is to say, I guess one of the things that grieves me is, more than anything else, I want the social gospel. We need it in our time, and it needs to be spoken courageously. But I'm also convinced that there is a moment in each of our lives when we are lost and we are found. And there is a sense of joy in that. There's a sense of joy in the church. What does the woman say? She says to her friends and neighbors, I want you to come with me and let's have a party. Let's share this joy together. William, I'm going to pick on our church because I've just been there 10 years. So I don't know all the history of things. So I'm probably going to rub somebody the wrong way, what I say. But it's interesting to me that when somebody comes forward making a profession of faith, we have to say, you're not really a member until we have our business meeting and church conference and vote you in. But we're really glad you're here, but don't think of yourself as being one of us yet. Now, I don't know what the history of that is. It may be that at some point in the life of faith or in the life of whoever put the bylaws and constitution together, there was somebody who came to join and that person really wasn't welcome. You know, that person has a bad reputation. We've heard about that person at the church where that person is, and all that person does is give problems to that. What I would like, and I'm not advocating changing the bylaws and constitution, but what I am advocating is the sense of collective joy when somebody comes to make either their commitment of their lives to follow Jesus or to become a part of the fellowship. I didn't know I had to wait to the first business meeting. That's back when we were having them once a month, so you could do it quicker. Now with every 3 months, you have to wait a while. But what I want us to see is that Jesus is pulling in with friends and neighbors. Jesus is pulling in the whole church. What is it that brings joy to a church? What is it that you and I experience in the life of our churches that really brings us a deep sense of joy. For Jesus, it was when the lost sheep was found, when the lost coin was found, and when the lost son was found, and he came home. All three of those parables talk about joy. But before I leave joy, I want to say, do you know joy can be offensive to people? Can you imagine the people that were listening to Jesus, the Pharisees and the scribes? This was offensive to them. Changes in people's lives can be offensive if the church is proclaiming the message that when you and I come to know Christ in our lives, both our individual lives as well as our whole outlook on people who are marginalized and oppressed, and all of those are changed. And there is an offense to that. If you are a Pharisee or you are a scribe, because first of all, you don't think you even need to come home, or your life even needs to be changed. Let me say one or two other things just quick things about the parable, and then I briefly want to talk about the parable. One of the things that I mentioned that I really do want to emphasize is about joy in the church. I'm not talking about giddiness. I'm talking about what is it that we see that we're about that is so vitally important that when it happens, when somebody's life is changed, or when the life of a church is changed, and all of a sudden they become involved in things that minister to the hungry and the poor and the oppressed and the weak, that there is a sense of joy about that. I often think about, did I take those things when I was a minister in a kind of a perfunctory way? Somebody comes forward, we introduce them. It's not that I wasn't happy. It wasn't that I wasn't joyful. But I don't ever remember going home and really being filled with a great sense of joy, except on a few occasions. So you and I can't read these parables without coming away with the impact on us of increasing our sense of joy. Remember, I said at the beginning, we all need to ask when we read a passage of scripture or we read a parable, we need to ask ourselves, what is this saying to me? Or what is this doing to me? What kind of change, what kind of impact is it making on my life? Do I read about the joy, read the parable, three parables, with the same thread weaving its way through, the thread of enormous joy? And then I have to ask myself, what is the impact of that parable on me? we're going to see next week a far more developed parable. I think I mentioned to you last time before we left each other, I think I mentioned to you last time, make sure you read verses 11 through 32 in the 15th chapter of Luke. Otherwise, we're not going to get to the end of the story. We're just going to be in the far country, and we want to get to the joy, and we're not going to get to the joy by verse 14. So we're going to look at that. But I want you to notice the way Jesus weaves these parables together in such a powerful thematic way. Chapter 14, it's about eating. With whom would you eat? Who would you invite to your table? In verse 15, it's about people and objects that are lost and then found. And I think we make our progression in this parable to the final, in this series of parables, in the 15th chapter of Luke. We make our final step when all of a sudden, it's not just a sheep, it's not just a coin, but it now is a person. And I would say that is one of the wonderful ways in reading the Gospel of Luke to see how Luke puts things together with what we call end stress, END stress. You don't want to leave the readers or the listeners with the least important thing. You don't want to start by jumping from the pinnacle of the temple at the beginning of a sermon. I know a minister who believes that he's got to have a YouTube story or something to begin a sermon that gets people's attention. The problem is that once he's told this wonderful story, he doesn't have anywhere to go. I mean, we've already jumped from the pinnacle of the temple. I said to him one time, he didn't pay any attention, but I said to him, we probably have people's attention about 3 to 4 minutes into the sermon. Now, if we don't say something by that point, either explicitly or implicitly, that gives our listeners or readers the idea that there is something in this message for their lives, they'll stop listening. Or they will go off and do the grocery list or create their own sermon. 3 to 4 minutes is about what we have. But a good, faithful preacher will have that. You don't need to start. What Jesus does here is not start with the son who came home, which is really the climax of these 3 parables. It is called end stress. He ends with a stress on the person whose life is changed. And we will come to that next week. Before I leave you, hopefully not as I did last time, but by the way, I didn't have any idea what had happened. I really thought William had pulled the plug. William was saying it's time for supper and I've had enough. He, but he told me it was my fault on my end. So that's a good pastor who says it's your fault. But I'll try not to do that way if I did something. Any observation, any questions, anything you have to say?